Welcome to Faith, Hope, and Stories. There are many people in our coastal community planting seeds of faith, hope, and love. Some you may know already, and others you don't know yet. They're your neighbors, and they have a calling, a mission, a purpose. These are their stories. Faith, Hope, and Stories is a production of Epworth United Methodist Church in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. Hello, I'm very excited to end the first season of our Faith, Hope, and Stories podcast with our next guest. I happen to be a fangirl, and I will just briefly say that I worked in Delaware politics for Ruth Ann Minner, John Carney, and Jack Markell, and as a reporter, I had dinner at Joe Biden's house several times. That was a long time ago, and I've become a bit jaded. But Sarah McBride is an inspiration. I recently finished her memoir, Tomorrow Will Be Different, which was published in 2018. I highly recommend that you read it and become more familiar with her story. She is our only member of Congress, and as Mike Castle's ads used to say, we only send one, let's send our best. I actually love that slogan. Sarah won in 2024 with 58% of the vote, a higher percentage than our governor, U.S. Senator, and even Kamala Harris. But we're not here today, I don't think, to talk about politics or policy for the most part. I think our audience would like to know more about Sarah, the person, and how she navigates, well, it seems to me like a constant barrage of ignorant BS, mostly from people who don't live here. I can't pretend it isn't there, but Sarah, you seem to move through that world with grace, resolve, amazingly good cheer, and a lot of caffeine. So welcome. This episode will actually air on your birthday, which is August 9th.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I can't think of a better way to spend my birthday than with you, even though it's not our actual birthday.
We'll pretend. I really did want to kind of speak to you, the personal, and kind of what motivates you and what inspires you and what still gives you hope. I know you were raised Presbyterian. Do you have a set of principles, a rule of life, a belief system that guides your decision making and how you live in politics and in the world at large?
So I was really lucky. I lucked out in the parent lottery. I was born to two loving and kind, compassionate, and curious parents. And I think those traits in them not only informed my upbringing and the upbringing of my two older brothers, but I think also informed their choice of faith community. We joined Westminster Presbyterian Church in Wilmington, Delaware, when I was about 5 or 6, I want to say. My brothers are 8 and 10 years older than me. So when we joined as a family, they were sort of well into their teenage years, whereas I really grew up in that church, in that faith community. And what I have been told by my parents was one of the reasons why they chose it was their not only robust adult education environment at Westminster, but the degree of curiosity that the church community had in big problems, in social justice, but also in questions of faith. And an environment like that built around shared faith to have a willingness to grapple with not just questions external to that central organizing faith, that central organizing principle, but a willingness to really interrogate it itself and be a space where questions and curiosity about faith itself were welcomed. That's one of the reasons why my parents chose it. And I think that curiosity that my parents had, that my family had, and that my church community had and has, I think really informed my value set. And I think for me, the word that I always come back to around my North Star and my sort of organizing principle for politics is just dignity. Affirming and respecting and upholding the individual dignity of every single individual person. And I think a foundational and critical way of upholding dignity is to show up, to see people, to listen to people, and at the end of the day, have curiosity in not only the experiences, but the perspectives and the beliefs of other people. Nothing matters if you can't start from that place that this other person has an inherent dignity that is worthy of being seen, heard, and for you to attempt to understand their experience and their perspective.
Mm-hmm. Talk to us a little bit more about your parents and the role they have played in your journey since you came out, their initial reaction, and how they became your staunchest advocates.
Sure. When I say I lucked out in the parent lottery, there is no clearer example of that luck than my experience coming out as trans to them. I watched them embrace my older brother's 10 years older than I am, who's openly gay when he came out to them in 2001, 2002, a period when gay identities were deeply politicized, when public opinion was very much not where it is today on gay rights and gay identities. I watched them embrace and support my older brother without skipping a beat. They were nervous for him, his safety, for the extra challenges that may come his way as an openly gay man in the mid 2000s, but there was never a hesitation that they would love and support and accept him. And I knew before I came out to them that that would be the place where they landed. But that would not necessarily be the place where they automatically started in a fully realized way. Even at the start, I never questioned whether they were going to support or love me, and they made clear that they supported and loved me. But it was much harder to actualize and operationalize when I first came out to them because of how scared they were. And unlike my brother, for whom they had examples of out gay people that they knew who were happy, healthy, and thriving, they didn't have that for me. And so my parents were devastated. But I knew, based on knowing my parents, but also reading and trying to understand what other families went through when a child, particularly a teenage to young adult child, came out. What I knew is that my parents would eventually get to that place where they could become and ultimately would become my staunchest advocates and allies publicly. But the speed with which they got there would be informed by actually the patience and grace that I extended their way. That a lack of patience and a lack of grace would stunt the speed with which they could walk with me toward that place of public, unwavering, unyielding support, because it might harden them in their concerns or in their fears. It might harden them in their confusion, and therefore maybe in their resistance. There was I knew they accepted me, but there was resistance. They didn't want me to come out to anyone else. They didn't want me to take the steps that I knew I needed to take to live a life free of the pain that had plagued me for the first 21 years of my life. And that experience and seeing that patience and that grace be met by them and reciprocated by them toward me, but then ultimately facilitate what I would say was a pretty rapid transformation in their comfort and support, that certainly also informs my approach ever since to change making. People's grace in our society has been abused, there's no question, but the course correction to that abuse of grace cannot be the elimination of all grace from our civic body and civic dialogue. We can have grace so long as people demonstrate growth, but that growth is only possible if the grace is first extended.
Yeah. It's ironic that grace is like uniquely a Christian concept. It doesn't always get practiced by all Christians. But speaking of grace and patience, how do you navigate the kind of performative theater targeted at you and the comments that seem to populate every one of your social media posts? I mean, some but not all of these comments come from your own constituents, and I have to admit I get really pissed off, and sometimes I respond myself. The flip side of that is, there's early in your congressional career, you made a choice to not engage with other lawmakers when they publicly challenged you with some of that performative theater, and you were criticized by the transgender community. I don't want to rehash that time, but to me, it says a lot about your philosophy of service. Can you speak to why you made the decision, what you do on a daily basis, like just everyday navigation of the world and the social media world and some of the big things that have been targeted toward you since you've been in office?
So, and you sort of alluded to this. The vast majority of the discourse about me online, including in my comment sections, are by people who are not Delawareans or by accounts that are not even people. They're bots.
Right, right.
Um, Obviously, to your point, inevitably, there are comments from people who are indeed constituents or neighbors of ours, and most of the time, I don't know them personally. Sometimes I actually will know the person personally. Um, but stepping back and realizing so much of what we see online today is not reflective of the communities we live in or even the country we live in. There is no question that the scale of bots online can normalize because, people have a difficult time knowing whether what they're seeing is actual human beings interacting with each other or whether it's bots interacting with humans or even bots interacting with other bots. And it's and a lot of the most extreme vitriolic hateful content we see online is from bots. And it does have the effect sometimes of normalizing that kind of rhetoric in real life among real people. And that is a danger and something that has occurred that we shouldn't pretend hasn't. And we should never mistake what we see online as representative of reality. It can impact real life, but it is not representative of it. And one of the things that allows me to contextualize and sort of push aside that discourse online, sometimes by humans, often not by humans, about me, is that one of the benefits of my job is that I am forced offline out into the real world, into blue areas and red areas and purple areas to have conversations with people who voted for me in the last election, people who didn't vote for me in the last election, people who didn't vote at all in the last election, people who think like I do and people who think very differently than I do. And what you realize when you are out there having those conversations about the things that you disagree with among the people that you disagree with them on is that people are good and decent and kind, and that we are not as divided as the algorithms make it seem. When you go online and you see this organic and intentional, right? It's a mix of both organic, algorithmically driven content and actually intentionally manipulated content that our social media is feeding us content that is meant to completely affirm what we believe or completely offend it. And in that environment where everything we are seeing online is so firmly in our own camp or so firmly opposed, it's easy to believe that not only people aren't good, it's easy to believe that we are so hopelessly divided that conversation and grace and persuasion are pointless because everyone who will be with me is already with me and everyone who opposes me is so far gone they will never be able to see my point or perspective. And that is not only not what real life shows me, but it is also fundamentally a cancer on democracy, because democracy can only exist if we maintain our faith in other people's capacity to change. And I firmly believe after 20 some years of work in change making of some form and some fashion, I truly believe that not only are people good and decent and kind, but that we can still tap their better angels. But I guarantee you, we cannot tap their better angels if we don't first authentically see those angels within them. People will be what we expect them to be. And if we want them to be the best versions of themselves, we have to truly and genuinely believe that those best versions are within them, that they are that, and that they have the capacity to grow and change. And that, for me, I have too much evidence in my own life, in our own history, to doubt that people still have that capacity and that people are still, at the end of the day, good and decent and kind and capable of channeling those better angels. So that's on the first part. This thing I would say really briefly to your point around the performative stuff that I faced in Congress. Some in the trans community didn't like it, and I get that because people in the trans community right now are scared and they're facing significant attacks. They don't have a lot of power, and people viscerally feel my highs and they viscerally feel my lows. And when I am facing indignity, when I do not respond in a way that they would want to respond, that they would hope that I would respond, or would want to respond themselves in a certain way, there isn't a release. And there is, I think, a fear that it normalizes or condones that behavior. But the reality is, when you're a first, the burden, the challenge, the unfairness, the discomfort that comes with being a first is recognizing that those who want to prove that you don't belong will be out in force. And in one of my favorite movies about a first, there's a line where Jackie Robinson in this movie, I'm not comparing my experience to Jackie Robinson, he's in the office of the owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers, and the owner says to him, "When you are a first, if you respond to a slur with a slur, they'll only hear yours. If you respond to a punch with a punch, they'll say you're the aggressor." People walking into a school with people hurling slurs at them, continuing to walk forward with dignity and grace, they were not normalizing the slurs. They were actually providing the public with a very clear visual contrast between their dignity and the unhinged hatred of those around them. And that public needs that very clear visual contrast that they will see and make judgments on in an instant as they are opening the newspaper, turning on TV, or just scrolling social media. The public needed to see who the aggressor was in that moment and who the innocent bystander was in that moment. And unfortunately, if I had responded in the way that some in my own community wanted me to respond, and in the way that those who were attacking me wanted to respond, it would have incentivized further attacks. It would have deprived the public with the very clear visual contrast between who was serious and who was unserious, who was there to work on all the issues and who was there to obsess on one kind of issue, who was being attacked and who the attacker was. And I am more confident than I've ever been that that strategy was right. It has reduced the attacks on me to the point where they are nearly non-existent at this point. It has maintained my effectiveness for my constituents. And in so doing, it provided the public with a very clear visual contrast, which is one of the many reasons why before the attacks, people said that the Democratic Party was more extreme on trans rights by about 60-40. After the attacks, the public said that the Republican Party was more extreme on trans rights by about 60-40.
Well, as a Delawarean who voted for you, I appreciate you putting your constituents first. I understand the whole dignity argument, and I understand why people might have gotten upset at your response. Talk about in real life and meeting people where they are. I mean, you just completed a tour of all 57 Delaware municipalities. How did that go from north to south and east to west?
It was energizing. I can't claim credit for the idea. Actually, Jack Markell, our mutual former boss, did it when he was running for governor in 2008. But I love getting to represent the entirety of Delaware. I love that I represent urban, suburban, and rural areas. I love that I get to represent a diverse state, both in identity and background and in perspective. And the warmth that I witnessed, the goodness that I witnessed over those 3 days, which I have witnessed over the last 2 years as Delaware's member of Congress, over the last several years running for Congress, and of course throughout my lifetime, that goodness that fills what Jack calls our state of neighbors was on full display for me. And I think that, if you want to run for office, if you want to serve in public office, at a time when there are some in our politics that are both implicitly and explicitly suggesting that political leaders should only deliver for or serve those who voted for them, and indeed should they present implicitly or explicitly should punish those who they presume didn't vote for them. That is corrosive to a democratic republic. It's corrosive to a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, where we have to believe and feel that our elected leaders are making decisions for the public good, not for one political coalition over the other. At that moment, it's incumbent upon people in my job to very clearly communicate that we are there not just to deliver for those who voted for us, but to deliver for all of our constituents, to serve all of our constituents, that we are there. We might not always agree on every issue, but that we respect, care for, and love, quite frankly, everyone that we represent, that all of their perspectives need to be heard. We aren't going to find consensus. We're not always going to agree. I'm going to vote in ways that many of my constituents might disagree with. But I believe it is a necessary starting point for an elected representative, for a democracy, for every constituent, no matter their party or their ideology, to be genuinely heard and seen in that system.
Right. What's the atmosphere? I'm delving into politics a little bit, but what is the atmosphere for compromise and reaching across the aisle right now? Because that was something you were very adamant about, reaching across the aisle.
So I think that, unfortunately, Washington is far more dysfunctional than it needs to be, should be, and certainly more dysfunctional than a lot of individual workplaces, local jurisdictions, or even state governments. The partisan toxicity in Washington is at a fever pitch in many ways. And I do not believe that finding opportunities to work across disagreement, I don't believe that, frankly, the necessary reality of compromise in order to make progress is something that must be avoided at all costs. I believe that it is often the grease of governing. And there have to be red lines in a negotiation. There have to be, as Ronald Reagan said, first principles. There have to be there has to be an effort to guarantee that you are not compromising beyond what you need to compromise in order to get progress achieved and advanced. But you have to make compromise, whether that's with your own coalition or whether that's with an opposition party, in order to get something done. And people need things done. People need progress. Time is of the essence for people, and they cannot afford to continue to wait for perfection. Because the reality is, in democracy, the tussle, the discomfort of both hard conversations and often hard-fought progress that doesn't arrive all in one moment, that is a feature of democracy, because the fact that you can't get everything you want all at once, it might be frustrating to you, but it's also the insurance that you have that your opposition will not get all that they want all at once. And the fact that you have to grapple with opposition parties, with differences in positions within your coalition, and of course that you have to grapple with public opinion, that is democracy in practice. Absolutism is only possible whether on the left or the right in authoritarianism.
Mm-hmm.
So I wish that we had more of an environment where we would work across disagreement. Now, I'm proud that more of my bills are bipartisan than any other freshman in Congress. I don't think people would necessarily have expected that. Now, it's still the big ticket controversial things that are hard to find common ground on, because that's where the perverse incentives of politics keep us further and further apart and prevent us from doing the give or take. But if you can find opportunities on issues outside the headline to build trust, to make progress, to build relationships, I believe that's the path toward us having some semblance of possibility of finding opportunities to work together and solve problems across the political divide on some of the bigger ticket items. And that's often been an approach that I've sought to tackle, of being principled and pragmatic all at the same time.
You've mentioned this, you alluded to this earlier when you were talking about your parents, and in your book, you recognize, I'm going back to the personal, you recognize that people seem to struggle more with the concept of being transgender than with being gay. But we seem to be going backwards in terms of understanding and acceptance. How could allies be most helpful here?
That's a great question, and I think you're absolutely right that there is no question that we are facing a cultural regression in this moment, not just substantively, but in public opinion. Support for marriage is less today than it was 3 or 4 years ago. To your point, support on individual issues facing the trans community, on individual policies around trans rights, by every objective metric, is worse today than it was 5 years ago. Now, there's still many issues of trans rights that maintain public support, that have a majority of support. But even on those issues, it is less support today than it was 4 or 5 years ago. And there are a whole host of reasons for that. There is no question that a well-funded, well-coordinated, right-wing regressive movement has successfully pushed public opinion backwards. There is no question, too, in my mind, that many of the strategies and tactics that we employed over the last 5 years, that they didn't work in staving off the regression. And I think that includes a strategy of shaming and blaming. That includes a strategy of cutting off conversation, and in many cases, cutting off relationships. I think none of those strategies worked. And they not only didn't work, I think they often created even more space for those well-funded right-wing efforts to advance their regressive priorities. If I was speaking to an ally right now, the number one thing I would say is, we need you to speak up and we need you to stay in conversation with people who aren't on our side. And on the first part, speaking up, you might not say everything perfectly. It's okay. It's okay not to get everything right. It's okay to be imperfect. You don't have to be the perfect ally. Indeed, imperfect allies are a necessary part of any coalition, because by definition, the need for allies means that you haven't convinced not only everyone, but the majority of the rightness of your cause on all of the issues that you care about. And so the need for imperfect allies is real. Our coalition, our community needs to recognize that. And those imperfect allies need to know that they can lean in and speak out, even if it's in imperfect ways, because we need everyone fundamentally reaffirming the inherent humanity and dignity of LGBTQ people in this moment. The second thing is that I think 5, 6, 7 years ago, to my point around this strategy of cutting off conversation and even cutting off relationships, it was done from a good place, right? It was done from this perspective of, someone says something that is hurtful to people I care about, and so in order to hold that person accountable, I will punish them by cutting them out of my life. And look, I get when you're an LGBTQ person, for instance, if you're in a space where a person is saying deeply hurtful things about LGBTQ people, you're going to want to extract yourself from that situation. I have no problem with that happening, especially if someone's mental and physical health is really at risk. I don't want all of my friends and family members and allies, though, to do the same with that person. because I want my friends and family and allies to be able to be proximate to that person so that they can continue to have conversations, to push back, to hold them accountable. And when you shut down conversation and when you cut people off, even with the best of intentions, you are eliminating the possibility for that person to change their behavior and grow, because you're ultimately relegating them to a siloed world that just agrees with what they're saying, rather than allowing them to continue to exist in diverse community that can actually push back and articulate a different position.
Right. I think I have time for one more question, and I just want to end on a hopeful note. And you've kind of touched on this, but what gives you hope about our state in our country, even though we're so dysfunctional and we seem so divided? But what still motivates you and gives you hope?
Two things. The first I've already mentioned, which is the goodness of people that I get to genuinely see. And I am grateful that I have that front row seat that unfortunately most people don't have. The second thing that gives me hope in this moment is the recognition that hope only makes sense in the face of hardship. That hope is not always a organic emotion, that it is often a conscious effort. And I think in the sort of post-1960s world, when we were riding a high under Obama, for instance, with sort of this sense of this unending cultural wave of momentum and progress, that if we simply worked for it and fought for it, that change was inevitable, that lent itself to sort of an organic sense of hope. And it doesn't feel that way anymore. It doesn't necessarily feel like if we volunteer and vote and tell our stories that things will work out, that we can inevitably bend the arc of the moral universe toward justice. It's hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And one of the things that I take comfort in as I serve in the House of Representatives and go onto the floor of the House, which Congress moved to in 1857, just before the Civil War, and you think about the long span of history and the challenges and the progress that occurred in that space and in that building, you realize that sense of organic hope is the exception in our history. That every previous generation has faced seemingly impossible odds, much greater than the ones we're facing right now. They had every reason to give up hope. They could not see the light at the end of the tunnel. And you cannot tell me that the reasons for hopelessness today are greater than the reasons for hopelessness for an enslaved person in the 1850s who had no reason to believe that an Emancipation Proclamation was on the horizon. You cannot tell me that the reasons for hopelessness today are greater than the reasons for hopelessness for an unemployed worker during the early days of the Great Depression who had never heard of a New Deal. And you cannot tell me that the reasons for hopelessness today are greater than the reasons for hopelessness for a closeted LGBTQ person in the 1950s who never knew of a country where they could live openly and authentically as themselves without violating the law. They had every reason to give up hope, but they didn't. They persevered, they summoned their hope, they found the light, and they changed the world. And I have to believe that if people could do it before, with far fewer tools in their tool chest than we have in ours today, far fewer rights and benefits and supports than we have today, then so too must we and can we in this moment summon that hope, find the light, and ultimately change the world again.
Thank you for listening to Faith, Hope, and Stories. This episode was produced by Leanne Walling. For more information on Epworth United Methodist Church, please go to our website at epworth.faith.